Hi there. This is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 26, Part 1. So I know I said that Chapter 26 is my favorite chapter, and that's a bit of hyperbole, I guess, because it's probably the most important chapter for my project of actually implementing Pierce's philosophy to live a quality existence. It's hard for me to pick a favorite chapter, so but there are a few that really resonate, and this one really helps out with what I'm trying to do. At one point in writing Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Pierce decided he really needed to concentrate properly on this book and not just during the hours of 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. before work in a coffee shop. So he took a leave of absence and took an RV trailer into the woods to write the final 6 chapters of this book, and 26 is the first of this 6. There's 32 chapters in the book. And ultimately he said that these 6 chapters were he felt they were the best ones. So it's cold in the campground when the narrator wakes up under his motorcycle, and he wakes up and sees it above him. The cycle looms silently over me, ready to start, as if it has waited all night like some silent guardian. Silver gray and chrome and black and dusty, dirt from Idaho and Montana and the Dakotas and Minnesota. From the ground up, it looks very impressive. No frills. Everything with a purpose. Everything with a purpose sort of sounds like the mantra of the classic temperament. I don't think I'll ever sell it. No reason to, really. They're not like cars, with a body that rusts out in a few years. Keep them tuned and overhauled, and they'll last as long as you do, probably longer. Quality. It's carried us so far without trouble. So you could buy an old motorcycle today. You could buy a motorcycle very much like Pierce's, if you looked around enough. But there's a danger of falling into the nostalgia trap where everything was better in the past. That's the full romantic temperament. And for someone like Pierce to get that motorcycle, maintain it, was a whole quality endeavor. Nowadays, a lot of people who do that kind of thing are sort of doing a lifestyle choice. It's like, going vinyl instead of digital music, and then buying all the high-tech turntables and audio equipment. And would you say that these are quality choices, or are they lifestyle choices? The key operating word is style. We talked about style in the last chapter. So are you doing it, kind of to be a hipster, let's just say, or are you doing it because you really appreciate the quality of an old thing? And I think that in this case, whether this is a quality choice or not, again, is not in the manifestation, but in the actual, let's just say the motivation, the intent. Is it a quality intent or is it a style intent? So he wakes Chris up with a big wake, and as customary, Chris sits bolt upright. I do my best to follow this with the opening quatrain of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. It looks like some desert cliff in Persia above us. But Chris doesn't know what the hell I'm talking about. He looks up at the top of the bluff and then just sits there squinting at me. You have to be in a certain mood to accept bad recitations of poetry, particularly that one. Now, I don't know what he means by particularly that one. And why this Omar Khayyam? Why the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam? Well, there's 2 reasons. The first one, let's just read the first quatrain, and then you can see what the what the obvious reason is. Awake, for morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight, and lo, the hunter of the east has caught the Sultan's turret in a noose of light. First, obviously it's appropriate for, it's kind of an amusing accompaniment to waking up poor Chris. But secondly, let's look at this line, the hunter of the East. Who was hunting for something in the East, and who might have memorized this poem? So the narrator's kind of, little by little, the poem comes back to him. At this first summer month that brings the rose, how did that go? I don't know. I don't even like the poem. I've noticed since this trip has started, and particularly since Bozeman, that these fragments seem less and less a part of his memory and more a part of mine. I'm not sure what that means. I just don't know. Again, sort of really being reluctant to make any kind of judgment as to what this means. And, we've discussed why he would be reluctant. We cross a dam and leave the canyon into some high semi-desert country. This is Oregon now. So they're crossing into Oregon. Let's get off Omar and onto the Chautauqua. Omar's solution is to just sit around and guzzle the wine and feel so bad that time is passing. And the Chautauqua looks good to me by comparison, particularly today's Chautauqua, which is about gumption. So I've talked about the Chautauqua a lot before actually, presenting this chapter. And of course, I refer to it as the Gumption Chautauqua. And like I said, it's really useful. So this chapter, the Chautauqua, is actually very easy to understand. The way he presents it is pretty straightforward, but the difficulty comes in implementing it. And that's what we are working on. I like the word gumption because it's so homely and so forlorn and so out of style. It looks as if it needs a friend and isn't likely to reject anyone who comes along. It's an old Scottish word, once used a lot by pioneers, but which, like kin, seems to have all but dropped out of use. I like it also because it describes exactly what happens to someone who connects with quality. He gets filled with gumption. The Greeks called it enthusiasmos, the root of enthusiasm, which means literally filled with theos, or God, or quality. See how that fits? So that's a very important line if you're trying to figure out Pirsig's views on religion. And we already saw that God and good have the same root, and then he basically says God and good have the same root, enough said. So without really going into his religious views, he's kind of telling us what he thinks. Basically, these two lines indicate that he thinks that, obviously quality and God are the same. And this is a big debate in my own head and in this corner of the internet, I think, at least my contribution to it, because we certainly talk about belief in God. So is quality God? So at this point, I think my own belief is that God introduces quality into the void, into the universe, and just lets it run. To me, I think that's the easiest way to reconcile God and quality, theology and Pirsig's work. This is what feels right to me for the time being, and maybe will be an enduring way of seeing it. I have a suspicion it will. A person filled with gumption doesn't sit around dissipating and stewing about things. He's at the front of the train of his own awareness, watching to see what's up the track and meeting it when it comes. That's gumption. And this can go even further in the sense that that dissipating and stewing that he talks about in psychology, you would say that this is rumination. And rumination is really an indication of, not being in a very good state psychologically. It's a really big problem when you're stuck in these negative emotional states for short, for brief periods or for, very, very long periods, for years, such as depression, you would say. So I'm going to mention my favorite neuroscientist, Jan Peksep, who said that the way to cure depression is enthusiasm. He said enthusiasm is the opposite of depression. In fact, he did some work trying to formulate a medication that would stimulate the seeking system. Remember, the seeking system underlays all your emotions, and to have that shut down is depression, according to Peksep, whatever causes it to be shut down, and have it stimulated is enthusiasm, is positive emotion. So he was trying to formulate a medication, and interestingly enough, he died last year, but he was instrumental in the ketamine studies, and so that's pretty interesting, and it makes some sense if you know anything about ketamine. The gumption filling process occurs when one is quiet long enough to see and hear and feel the real universe, not just one's own stale opinions about it. But it's nothing exotic. That's why I like the word. Now there's something we can work with. That first sentence says it all, and you will see the process behind this sentence repeated again and again in as advice in this Chautauqua and throughout the book. So let me repeat it because it's very important. The gumption filling process occurs when one is quiet long enough to see and hear and feel the real universe, not just one's own stale opinions about it. So notice what he says here about the real universe. So let's look at John Vervaeke's relevance realization. For obvious reasons, it's my favorite concept of his work, but my other favorite concept is that of the real world versus the everyday world. And when you have a glimpse into the real world, into the harmony of the universe, when you have your feet planted solidly on the ground of being, this is what Pirsig is also talking about. It sounds like the most mystical of all experiences, and in a way it is, but it's also, as the Zen masters say about enlightenment, that it's nothing special. And Pirsig says sometimes you see people getting back from long fishing trips, and they have this kind of calmness, harmony. But in our society, they could also feel guilty about spending a week or two just fishing, and feeling guilty potentially about wasting time. But Pirsig says he hasn't been wasting time. It's only our limited cultural viewpoint that makes it seem so. And this is where the Eastern viewpoint can be it can be infused effectively with our Western viewpoint, which is, of course, much of what Pirsig was trying to do, is reconcile these two viewpoints. And if we're talking about a change in consciousness that needs to occur to take us from game A to game B, and this is a very easy way to conceptualize this shift in consciousness that has to take place with the way things are now, then a reintroduction, one thing you could say, if you're trying to implement Pirsig's philosophy, you could say reintroduction into the idea that guiltlessly enjoying a hobby like fishing or hiking or camping or a meditation retreat, is they're very popular now, is something that we could all introduce into our lives. And the big problem, I think, is that we conflate doing something like scrolling through Instagram or looking at Facebook as the same as any downtime, and it's not. And it's because we're so oriented towards productivity and work that it's either working, being productive, or wasting time. And there's not much in between, in a lot of Western thought, namely American thought. Although we do see this changing, but spending downtime doing something that's gumption building is very different from just really wasting time, which is what we do on the internet. And I think one of the, if I was to start looking at ways to take this philosophy and implement it in the world, and I think I'm going to really talk about this later, but I think the main thing we need to do right off the bat is really cut our ties to the internet to a large extent. Start using it much more judiciously. I think this is one of the biggest problems we face spiritually and psychologically these days. It's much bigger than we actually acknowledge. Gumption is the psychic gasoline that keeps the whole thing going. If you haven't got it, there's no way a motorcycle can possibly be fixed. But if you have got it and know how to keep it, there is absolutely no way in this world that the motorcycle can keep from getting fixed. It's bound to happen. Having that kind of faith is something that's very difficult for us. Therefore, the thing that must be monitored at all times and preserved before anything else is the gumption. Okay, so listen to that. I mean, that's like someone who's come down from heaven and given us one of the greatest pieces of life advice we could ever get. But we don't really hear this. What we hear is, oh, well, maybe if you go to the right mechanic and stuff, your motorcycle will get fixed, but don't do it yourself. I mean, sometimes we hear that. So this is this is difficult to kind of really grasp, is this faith that you have that if you are pursuing quality, whatever you do is going to work out, even if it doesn't seem like it's working out during your, let's just say, stuckness or your gumption trap or your lateral drift or whatever situation you're in before you actually reach peace of mind. reach the peace of mind that concludes a successful project. Like quality is the driving force of the universe, so gumption is the psychic gasoline that is the manifestation of energy and drive, let's just say in a person, although we're going to discuss it later, that it's the manifestation of energy and drive in everything. You could say gumption is also the coal that fills the train engine. And I think as a therapist, one of the biggest problems I see, and I was just talking about this kind of, is lack of gumption or lack of motivation. I guess you could say lack of enthusiasm, but let's just say lack of motivation. So this next paragraph is sort of like the one in chapter 25, where the mechanic is doing that back and forth thing between being inspired by the next quality stimulus and then implementing it rationally, back and forth. I guess you could say this is the flow state. I guess this is the lingo again. I think I've mentioned this, that you might use for this experience, and maybe even for gumption. Gumption and flow, I think, are very, very interrelated. And I'm sorry I keep using this word flow, but this is part of me trying to work out what he's saying in a way we can use. So as I present these chapters in this reading series, I have the ulterior motive of exploring how to articulate how we can use this in everyday life. But there's another kind of detail that no shop manual goes into, but that is common to all machines and can be given here. This is the detail of the quality relationship, the gumption relationship between the machine and the mechanic. Again, this is what we're talking about, which is just as intricate as the machine itself. Throughout the process of fixing the machine, things always come up. Low-quality things, from a dusted knuckle to an accidentally ruined irreplaceable assembly. These drain off gumption, destroy enthusiasm, and leave you so discouraged you want to forget the whole business. I call these things gumption traps. So here's an interesting thing he says about gumption traps and how they affect motorcycle maintenance. Motorcycle maintenance gets frustrating, angering, infuriating, and that's what makes it interesting. So the frustration also has this undercurrent of keeping things exciting. And I guess what's exciting is that kind of, if you can overcome the damage it does to gumption, this keeps you going. So the gumption traps have this other way of making it exciting because you want to overcome it. You also could do the opposite. You want to just give up on the whole thing, and he talks about this. Also, remember that stuckness really, though, is where you want to be, because it's in that state that quality will emerge if you let it. Overcoming gumption traps is letting the quality emerge, or just being with it. So overcoming gumption traps is letting the quality emerge. What I have in mind now is a catalog of gumption traps I've known. I want to start a whole new academic field, gumptionology, in which these traps are sorted, classified, structured into hierarchies, and interrelated for the edification of future generations and the benefit of all mankind. Gumptionology 101. The examination of effective cognitive and psychomotor blocks in the perception of quality relationships. 3CR, 7 MWF. Some kind of categorization, I guess. Syllabus. I'd like to see that in a college catalog somewhere. So there actually is gumptionology these days. That is, there seems to be a trend to teach people how to get in the flow state, and it's even big business. For example, if you remember that discussion on Rebel Wisdom of the three fellows, Jordan, Hall, David, and I'm not going to try to pronounce his name right now, and Jamie Wheel was the third one. And Jamie Wheel, this is his business. He has a company, or he works for a company, or he's a partner in a company that teaches executives how to increase productivity by being in the flow state more of the time. I'll put a link below to that. It's kind of interesting. John Vervaeke recommends Tai Chi, and Taoism, and through Taoism, and I think that's more along the lines of what I'm comfortable with. I kind of don't like the idea of commercializing the flow state. I can't completely object to it, but for me personally, I don't really like that idea. I prefer this as an underlying spiritual practice. I get that meditation and stuff can be useful for productivity, but I'm uncomfortable with that in the same way that quality is made subservient to reason, and we're going to get into that later. I think quality needs to be the big thing, and you should be in a spiritual practice first and let the flow state and let quality follow, or let me try to explain that in a better way. I think that quality really does need to be the primary reality. You don't try to harness quality or harness the flow state so you can do better in the subject-object world, let's just say, make more money, or that being your objective. I think the objective needs to be a higher quality existence. And then what you do from that existence is where is much better than I guess I shouldn't say this, but I am going to say it, is better than making money, and it's better than being a productive executive. I think that is more the solution to overcoming game A. So I don't know what Pirsig would think of all this. I think that he preferred really what I'm talking about. I mean, even though he's, sarcastic or facetiously saying that he'd like to teach gumptionology. And I think, for the betterment of the world, he probably would, but I don't think he'd want to whittle it down to something that is going to, make you more productive in your line of work, for example. I think he prefers more learning how to have peace of mind and then allow things to follow from that. And that would be things like lateral drift, going fishing, staring at the motorcycle until quality kicks in. In traditional maintenance, if you have gumption, they say you're lucky or something. In traditional motorcycle maintenance, they say gumption is a fixed commodity. Well, that's a very sad state of affairs then, because that means only some of us have it. In non-dualistic maintenance, gumption isn't a fixed commodity. It's variable, a reservoir of good spirits that can be added to or subtracted from. Since it's a result of the perception of quality, a gumption trap, consequently, can be defined as anything that causes one to lose sight of quality and therefore lose one's enthusiasm for what one is doing. So the loss of enthusiasm, that's a big deal. We're talking about that in mental health, too. So enthusiasm is what keeps everything moving, let's just say. There are two main kinds of gumption traps, setbacks and hang-ups. And setbacks are external, and therefore, in this chapter, they're pretty specific. They're caused by actual issues of the motorcycle of a physical nature. Hang-ups are internal, and I think my interest is more in that direction. So I'm not going to go too much into the external ones, the setbacks. There are three setbacks. There's the out-of-sequence reassembly setback, which you can imagine what that is, and you can imagine how bad it is. There's the intermittent failure setback, and then there's the parts setback. So a lot of this section just has pretty straightforward advice. But some of these problems seem to be archetypal in a way that the way that they're solved could be applied to other situations and endeavors. And I don't think I'm really prepared yet to do that. So if you read these sections, maybe you might have some, because they can be construed as pretty standard problems. So I want to read this one paragraph though, because I think this is very useful to a concept that keeps coming up. It should be inserted here parenthetically that there's a school of mechanical thought which says I shouldn't be getting into a complex assembly I don't know anything about. I should have training or leave the job to a specialist. That's a self-serving school of mechanical eliteness I'd like to see wiped out. That was a specialist who broke the fins on this machine. I've edited manuals written to train specialists for IBM. And what they know when they are done isn't that great. You're at a disadvantage the first time around, and it may cost you a little more because of parts you accidentally damage, and it will almost undoubtedly take you a lot more time. But the next time around, you're way ahead of the specialist. You, with Gumption, have learned the assembly the hard way, and you've a whole set of good feelings about it that he's unlikely to have. So rather than specifics, this aspect of the advice is one that we can really use. Remember the Grille Assembly a few chapters ago? I think it was about 10 chapters ago. Well, the takeaway from that was that the standard way of assembling a grill or anything else is, like there isn't a standard way. Like it's really arbitrary, but we don't believe that. We think there's a set way, and that's the way in the instructions. And remember what he told us about the instructions, that you get kind of the dumbest guy to put it together, and then that's in the factory, and that's the manual. But really, anything that gets to the final product, what you want to achieve, is valid, and it doesn't matter what the solution is as long as it has quality. But this is really hard for us to wrap our minds around. We're so used to objectivity in technological practices and in scientific practices. We believe that objectivity actually exists, just like we believe there is one truth. And this is a big danger, because if we think objectivity is going to give us the best solution, we're in a lot of trouble these days as we lay the groundwork for AI. The substrate of AI needs to be formulated with the process of quality. So I hope that makes sense, but that's why it's one of the reasons it's extremely important now, because as we're laying this foundation in this technological age, if we think that there's an objective truth to how to do it, an objective value to how to do it, we could put ourselves in a very precarious situation. And one thing you'll notice about Pirsig's advice is that he's very, very careful and takes an interest in being careful. Often us romantic types are not like this. If you look at the Big Five, for example, some of us romantics are rather low in orderliness and conscientiousness. And that often goes with high openness. And that's why being high in both conscientiousness and openness is so valuable. It means you are a good combination of classic and romantic. The good news is you can actually work on this. You can become more classic if you're romantic. It's harder to become more romantic if you're classic. If you're diligent, and you're careful, and you get used to being careful, you can actually become more careful. But it's hard to get more open-minded. One thing that's recommended for becoming more open-minded is psychedelics. And that is exactly what opens Phaedrus up in Lila. So I'm not going to go again into these setbacks too much, but for example, the parts setbacks, he goes into how to, get the best parts, or how to get the best price, or how to make sure the parts fit. In a weird way, his advice is still relevant even in the days of Amazon, because a lot of the problems are the same. And I think a big parts problem we obviously have today is how cheap and shoddy the Chinese knockoffs are. And he says that, a lot of the people who produce the cheap parts don't have access to the original engineering. That's kind of interesting. And maybe there was some equivalent back then. I mean, he says, used tools are often much better than the new ones. And that is certainly the case today, unless you really, really pay a lot of money. Here is the last paragraph in the parts setback that I want to read, because I think this is more in keeping with what I'm trying to do. Finally, if you're as exasperated as I am by the parts problem, you have some money to invest, you can take up the really fascinating hobby of machining your own parts. The work of machining a part is very slow, and some parts, such as ball bearings, you're never going to machine, but you'll be amazed how you can modify parts designs so you can make them with your equipment. And the work isn't nearly as slow or frustrating as to wait for some smirking parts man to send away to the factory. And the work is gumption building, not gumption destroying. To run a cycle with parts in it you've made yourself gives you a special feeling you can't possibly get from strictly store-bought parts. Okay, you could apply that to a lot of things in life. So a certain degree of control and independence, let's just say, of how you are doing things in your life. Again, culling together quality secondhand items in your clothing or in your furniture, making your furniture, making clothing, gardening, growing your own food. You're going to get you're going to get a lot of satisfaction, and you're probably going to get a higher quality product or vegetable if you grow it yourself. You're going to get something much better in your home than if you let some interior decorator do it and buy stuff from China. So I just really like that paragraph. And working on machines is something we can still do now. And let me just get back to what I was saying about the intention. Is it, a style, a lifestyle choice, or is your intention high quality? It would be more of a hobby these days to work on a motorcycle because the machines of today are so computer oriented, which leads to another question. Is being a great computer programmer, a great problem solver in that regard, is the same as being a great mechanic? There's something about mechanical devices that is still grounded, obviously, in our physical relationship with the universe. And this is lacking big time in the digital world that we are inhabiting. So another thing about taking on a hobby like motorcycle maintenance, machining your own parts, gardening, making your own clothes, making your own furniture, that kind of thing. It could be anachronistic or a lifestyle choice, but it could also be a spiritual practice. If you are trying to be more connected with the physicalness of your environment, because we are so far removed from it these days, and the repercussions, we could go into the repercussions of that. Time now to consider some of the internal gumption traps that operate at the same time. As the course description of gumptionality indicated, this internal part of the field can be broken down into three main types of internal gumption traps. Those that block effective understanding, called value traps. Those that block cognitive understanding, called truth traps. And those that block psychomotor behavior, called muscle traps. The value traps are by far the largest and most dangerous group. This episode, we're just going to discuss value traps. The other two will be in part 2 of chapter 26. Of the value traps, the most widespread of pernicious is value rigidity. This is an inability to revalue what one sees because of commitment to previous values. In motorcycle maintenance, you must rediscover what you do as you go. Okay, that's that back and forth we were talking about. Rediscovering what you do as you go. Rigid values make this impossible. The typical situation is that the motorcycle doesn't work. The facts are there, but you don't see them. You're looking right at them, but you don't yet have enough value. This is what Phaedrus was talking about. Quality, value creates the subjects and objects of the world. The facts do not exist until value has created them. If your values are rigid, you can't really learn new facts. And this is where we have a very hard time, because those value systems can be very ingrained. And this is also related to the ego trap, which we'll talk about in the next episode. Our values are very much tied up with our ego, whether they are the ones we use to define ourselves in the big picture or the local ones we use to define the problem. So good problem formulation means dispensing with this value rigidity. So you, like a premature diagnosis, you have to, let it go, and it's painful. It's painful to let the old values go, and this is what makes implementing this stuff hard. One of the reasons implementing this stuff is hard, even though it's easy to understand intellectually. Also, if you're hung up on how quality creates the subjects and objects of the world, that's what he was just talking about, is a great way of framing it. That when you see value, you act on it. And this action is creative. And you and the value you see create whatever it is. And you create it together. And ultimately, this creative activity can yield something that really lasts. And if enough people get to see the value in the same way, then they agree on, then that agreement creates the object that we all see as an object. And I hope that makes sense. This often shows up Okay, here's the premature diagnosis. This often shows up in premature diagnosis when you're sure you know what the trouble is, and then when it isn't, you're stuck. Then you've got to find some new clues, but before you can find them, you've got to clear your head of old opinions. If you're plagued with value rigidity, you can fail to see the real answer even when it's staring you right at the face because you can't see the new answer's importance. So there's a really good term in writing. It's sometimes you have to kill your darlings. And that means in order for the writing you're doing to work, you have to edit out words or edit out sentences or edit out phrases you just love that you're so attached to. And attachment is a good word to use to describe value rigidity. And that's also good, that's also why suffering in Buddhism is attachment, is because you're attached to this thing that is undermining you, that is not getting you into that flow state. And of course, ultimately, I think where we want to be is open and in the flow state and open to perceiving quality. You can phrase it a whole lot of ways, but this is really where we want to be. This is the antidote to all the negative emotional stuff we're talking about, like depression. The birth of a new fact is always a wonderful thing to experience. It's dualistically called a discovery because of the presumption that it has an existence independent of anyone's awareness of it. Subject-object way of thinking. When it comes along, it always has, at first, a low value. Then, depending on the value looseness of the observer and the potential quality of the fact, its value increases either slowly or rapidly, or the value wanes and the fact disappears. Okay, I think the value looseness is a way of also describing peace of mind. And like Poincaré pointed out, you can't check every fact. This is Vervaeke's combinatory explosion, that there are infinite facts. And that's why relevance realization is important and why this particular concept figures in and is parallel to Pirsig's work. So we pre-select on the basis of quality, or to put it Phaedrus's way, the track of quality pre-selects what data we're going to be conscious of, and it makes the selection in such a way as to best harmonize what we are with what we are becoming. Beautiful, beautiful sentence. What you have to do if you get caught in this gumption trap of value rigidity is slow down. You're going to have to slow down anyway, whether you want to or not. But slow down deliberately and go over ground that you've already been over to see if the things you thought were important were really important, and to, well, just stare at the machine. That's that advice. That's this very similar advice that we have been getting all along. Slow down and be with it. There's nothing wrong with that. Just live with it for a while. Watch it the way you watch a line when fishing, and before long, as sure as you live, you get a little nibble and a little fact, asking in a timid, humble way if you're interested in it. That's the way the world keeps on happening. Be interested in it. Be open to quality, because quality makes the world happen. And if you're interested in it, if you care, a quality solution starts to emerge. So let's just say that fact you need is a little fish, is a fish nibbling, and sometimes the fish is too small and you have to throw it back. But sometimes there are bigger fish in the same school, and those bigger fish are what you're trying to catch. And sometimes there's a better species of fish down there than the one you thought you were fishing for. That is, if you concentrate on what's biting rather than what kind of fish it is. After a while, you may find that the nibbles you get are more interesting than your original purpose of fixing the machine. When that happens, you've reached a kind of point of arrival. Then you're no longer strictly a motorcycle mechanic, you're also a motorcycle scientist, and you've completely conquered the gumption trap of value rigidity. Okay, and I like this next part. This is in the journey again. The road has come up into the pines again, but I see by the map that it won't be for long. There are some resort billboards along the road and some kids beneath them, almost as if part of the advertisement, gathering pine cones. They wave, and in doing this, the littlest boy drops all his cones. That really recreates a wholesome scene, the kind that we barely ever see anymore, and people younger than me may not have ever really understood this wholesomeness that used to be so much part of life. I keep wanting to go back to that analogy of fishing for facts. And I can just see somebody asking with great frustration, yes, but which facts do you fish for? There's got to be more than that. But the answer is, if you know which facts you're fishing for, you are no longer fishing. You've caught them. No, obviously not. You don't know what the quality solution is going to be. Quality plus your boxcars and that beautiful third. There are so many combinations out there. They're infinite. Again, we have to get out of the mindset that there is one way of doing things. There is the stale way that you may need, that may actually you need at some times, and that's the old way. And then there's the better way, which is the fresh way. I'm trying to think of a specific example. And he does think of a specific example, and it's not from cycle maintenance. It's the South Indian monkey trap, and that's the trap that consists of a hollowed out coconut that's chained to a tree or a stake, and the coconut has some rice in it, and there's a hole, and the monkey can put his hand in the hole, but if he grabs the rice, then suddenly his fist is too big to pull out. So he's trapped. He doesn't want to drop the rice, because he's ingrained that the most valuable thing is food, but as it turns out, his value rigidity is keeping him trapped. There is a fact this monkey should know, that if he opens his hands, he's free. But how is he going to discover this fact? By removing the value rigidity that rates the rice above freedom. How is he going to do that? Well, he should somehow try to slow down deliberately and go over ground that he has been over before and see if things he thought were important really were important. And well, stop yanking and just stare at the coconut for a while. So that's chapter 26, the first part. And I'm going to leave you with a short film that Lee Glover compiled for this chapter. It's really great to see the actual route with these photos and clips he provides. And this is a little 4-minute film that I'm going to include right now. So I hope that made sense. And I will see you next Sunday for chapter 26, part 2.